In the early 2000s, a simple cotton t-shirt sold in the United States for less than the price of a cup of coffee. Most shoppers never asked why. They only noticed that year after year, prices seemed to fall instead of rise. Behind that cheap shirt was a quiet transformation unfolding half a world away. Factories in southern China were running day and night. Lights stayed on through the darkness. Ports stayed open through holidays. Ships left loaded to the waterline, bound for every corner of the globe. For many people, this felt like progress. Life became more affordable. Stores became fuller. Inflation stayed low even as incomes rose. But cheap things always have a cost. It is just not always paid by the person holding the receipt. According to archived trade data, by 2010 China was producing more manufactured goods than the next several countries combined: steel, electronics, clothing, furniture, toys. If something could be made, it was increasingly made there. Inside China, this was described as a miracle. Hundreds of millions were lifted out of poverty. Entire cities appeared where farmland once stood. Highways and rail lines spread faster than maps could be updated. One former factory manager reportedly described the feeling this way: "Every year we were told to make more and charge less. If we succeeded, we were rewarded. If we failed, someone else would replace us." For a long time, the system seemed unstoppable. Lower prices meant higher exports. Higher exports meant more factories. More factories meant more jobs. But there was a problem hiding in plain sight. The system only worked as long as someone somewhere could still make money. By the mid-2010s, profit margins inside China began to shrink. Not suddenly, quietly, almost politely. According to industry reports, many factories were selling goods at prices barely above cost. Some were selling below cost. They kept going anyway. Local officials encouraged production to continue. Banks continued lending. Workers continued showing up. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. Exports were strong, output was rising. The numbers still moved in the right direction. Inside the system, however, something had changed. Efficiency was no longer creating prosperity. It was slowly erasing it. This is the heart of the China trap. A situation where making things cheaper stops being an advantage and starts becoming a threat. When everything becomes cheap enough to win, no one actually wins. The question is not whether China can produce more. It clearly can. The question is simpler and far more dangerous. What happens when the world's most efficient economy becomes too efficient to survive? The real story does not begin in the skyscrapers or the megafactories. It begins in a meeting room in Beijing in December 1978. At that time, China was still poor by any global measure. Most people lived in rural areas. Factories were inefficient. Wages were low, but productivity was lower. That year, Deng Xiaoping addressed senior party officials with a message that quietly changed everything. He said that poverty was not socialism. He said that development mattered more than ideology. According to archived records, one phrase stood out. Getting rich was no longer something to be ashamed of. This was not announced to the world as a revolution. It was framed as an experiment, a correction. China began opening small pockets of its economy to market forces. They were called special economic zones, places where old rules did not fully apply. One of them was Shenzhen. In 1980, it was a fishing town with around 30,000 people. Most roads were unpaved. Most buildings were low and temporary. According to local accounts, farmers suddenly found themselves leasing land to factories. Young workers arrived from the countryside with little more than a bag of clothes. Foreign investors arrived with contracts and machines. A former resident later recalled the change. Every month there was a new building. Every year there was a new factory. The results came faster than anyone expected. Wages rose, exports surged, tax revenue followed. Officials in other provinces took notice. If Shenzhen worked, why not everywhere else? By the late 1980s, similar zones were spreading along the coast. Local governments were given targets: grow faster, export more, create jobs. The incentive structure was simple. Officials who delivered growth advanced. Those who did not were quietly replaced. At first, the system rewarded genuine improvement: better roads, better ports, better logistics. But hidden inside this success was a subtle shift. Growth stopped being the result. It became the requirement. Factories were not just businesses anymore. They were proof that the system was working. This raises a quiet but important question. What happens when growth stops being a means and becomes an obligation? Because once that line is crossed, stopping is no longer an option. The first real shift in power came in the 1990s. Not with a speech or a law, but with a steady flow of contracts. In 1992, Deng Xiaoping made a tour of southern China. According to official records, he praised the coastal regions for their speed and openness. The message was clear to those listening closely. The experiment was now the model. Around the same time, global supply chains were changing. American and European companies were under pressure to cut costs. Retailers demanded lower prices. Shareholders demanded higher margins. China offered something no one else could match: large numbers of workers, improving infrastructure, local governments willing to move fast. By the mid-1990s, foreign direct investment into China was rising sharply. In 1995 alone, it exceeded $30 billion. One purchasing manager for a Western electronics firm reportedly explained the decision simply: if we did not move production to China, our competitors would. Factories multiplied along the coast. Electronics in Guangdong, textiles in Zhejiang, machinery in Jiangsu. With each new factory came a transfer of power. Design stayed abroad. Production moved east. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. This was a turning point. Tariffs fell, access expanded. Orders surged. According to trade data, Chinese exports more than quadrupled between 2001 and 2008. Entire industries in the West struggled to compete. Workers in Europe and North America noticed factories closing. Communities hollowed out. Manufacturing jobs disappeared quietly. Inside China, the mood was different. Cities grew richer. Local revenues rose. Officials were praised for delivering results, but the balance of power had shifted. China was no longer just participating in global trade. It was setting the price floor. The cheapest producer was no longer a single factory. It was an entire country. That created a new reality. Once China became the benchmark for low-cost production, everyone else had to follow. This leads to a simple but unsettling question. What happens when an entire economy becomes locked into winning only by being cheaper than everyone else? To understand what happened next, it helps to look beneath the surface. The visible factories were only part of the system. Behind them sat a quiet financial machine. Local governments controlled land. State-owned banks controlled credit. Production targets shaped decision-making. When a company wanted to build a factory, the process was smooth. Land was leased at low cost. Loans were approved quickly. Permits moved faster than in most countries. According to insiders, this was not corruption in the usual sense. It was alignment. Local officials needed growth to advance their careers. Banks needed borrowers to justify expansion. Factories needed scale to survive. So the system encouraged building. More capacity, more output, more volume. A steel mill that produced more was praised. A solar factory that expanded faster was rewarded. What mattered was motion, not profitability. One provincial official reportedly explained it this way: if the factory closes, the jobs disappear. If the jobs disappear, the numbers look bad. This created a powerful feedback loop. When demand slowed, production did not stop, it increased. Prices fell, margins shrank. But output kept rising. To outside observers, this looked irrational. Why make more when profits fall? Inside the system, the logic was different. Production signaled stability, shutdown signaled failure. Debt played a quiet role. Local governments borrowed heavily to build industrial parks. Factories were needed to service that debt. According to public filings, by the mid-2010s, many local governments relied on industrial land sales and factory taxes to meet budgets. Stopping production was not just an economic choice. It was a political one. This is the hidden mechanism of the China trap. A system where efficiency is enforced not by markets alone, but by incentives that punish slowing down. The question then becomes unavoidable. How long can a system reward output while ignoring return? The consequence did not arrive with a crash. It arrived quietly, over several years. By the early 2010s, something unusual began appearing in financial reports. Output was rising, revenue was rising more slowly. Profits were falling. According to published industrial data, profit margins in several manufacturing sectors dropped below 5%. In steel, margins were often near zero. In some solar panel factories, losses were reported even during peak demand years. Inside boardrooms, executives reportedly reacted with disbelief at first. then with denial, then with acceptance. One factory owner in Zhejiang allegedly shared his frustration privately. "We sell more units every year. We make less money every year." The unexpected consequence was not collapse. It was persistence. Instead of closing, factories stayed open. Instead of cutting capacity, companies expanded it. The logic seemed backwards, but it was widespread. If margins were thin, volume was the only lever left. Workers felt the change before consumers did. Wages stopped rising. Overtime increased. A migrant worker reportedly described the shift. "Before, bonuses came every year. Now we are told to work harder to keep the same pay." Local governments took notice as well. Tax revenue growth slowed. Debt levels rose. According to regional budget documents, some cities relied on factory output numbers more than actual profit to meet targets. What nobody expected was this: an economy could appear strong on the surface while quietly weakening underneath. Goods kept flowing outward. Money stopped flowing upward. This raises a difficult question. If an economy grows without creating returns, who is it really growing for? And once that question is asked, it becomes harder to ignore. The next phase unfolded through escalation, not correction. When margins thinned, the response was not restraint. It was acceleration. From 2015 onward, credit expanded again. State-owned banks increased lending to industrial firms. Local governments approved new projects at record speed. According to public balance sheet data, industrial debt rose sharply during this period. In some provinces, factory-related borrowing doubled within a few years. The reasoning was consistent across regions. If production slowed, employment would suffer. If employment suffered, stability would be questioned, so capacity grew. Steel plants expanded. Battery factories multiplied. Electric vehicle assembly lines appeared faster than buyers. One local planner reportedly described the pressure. Stopping construction felt riskier than continuing. Global conditions added fuel. Trade tensions increased after 2018. Export uncertainty rose. Instead of pulling back, firms pushed harder. They cut prices to secure orders. Competitors followed. By 2020, price competition intensified across multiple sectors. Solar panel prices fell sharply. Electric vehicle discounts became common. According to industry filings, some manufacturers accepted losses to maintain market share. Workers noticed again. Contracts became shorter. Raises were postponed. A supplier reportedly shared a quiet observation. "Everyone is fighting for the same orders." Government support stepped in to soften the blow. Subsidies expanded. Tax relief was offered. But support came with conditions. Keep producing. Keep employing. This escalation created momentum of its own. More supply chased limited demand. The system was no longer reacting to markets, it was reacting to itself. That leads to an uncomfortable question. When every solution requires more production, what happens when production is the problem? The breaking point did not announce itself with panic. It appeared as a series of small, uncomfortable signals. By the early 2020s, inventories were building faster than sales. Warehouses filled. Finished goods waited longer for buyers. According to customs and industry reports, exports remained high but unit prices kept falling. More goods were moving. Less value was being captured. One electric vehicle factory reportedly stored thousands of unsold cars in open lots. They sat exposed to weather. They waited for discounts deep enough to clear them. Inside companies, pressure mounted. Cash flow tightened. Suppliers waited longer to be paid. Local banks noticed the strain. Loan extensions became more common. New lending required quiet guarantees. A financial officer allegedly described internal meetings during this period. The focus was no longer growth. It was survival. Government agencies faced a dilemma. Allow closures and risk unemployment, or support production and deepen losses. In several sectors, intervention followed. Mergers were encouraged. Weaker firms were absorbed. According to regulatory notices, some factories were instructed to slow output without formally shutting down. For workers, the change was personal. Shifts were cut. Temporary contracts were not renewed. One assembler reportedly recalled the moment. The line was still moving, but fewer people were standing beside it. This was the moment the system revealed its limit. Efficiency could no longer hide imbalance. The question was no longer whether the model worked. It was whether it could change. And once that question surfaced, it could not be pushed back down. When all the pieces are placed together, a clear pattern emerges. It is older than China. It appears wherever production becomes identity. History offers several quiet parallels. In the late 19th century, British coal output surged far beyond domestic demand. Prices fell. Miners worked longer hours for shrinking pay. In the 1970s, Japan's manufacturing engine reached a similar point. Factories were world-class. Efficiency was unmatched. Returns began to fade. According to economic records, Japan entered a long period of deflation soon after. Growth continued on paper. Wealth creation slowed in reality. Even further back, Roman agriculture followed the same path. Large estates produced grain at massive scale. Prices collapsed. Small farmers disappeared. The underlying pattern is simple. When success is measured by output alone, systems overproduce. Over time, competition stops rewarding improvement. It rewards endurance. In such systems, the strongest players do not innovate. They wait, they accept losses longer than others can survive. They rely on scale, credit, or state support. Eventually, smaller participants exit. Capacity concentrates. Choice narrows. This pattern is often mistaken for dominance. In reality, it is exhaustion. China's situation fits this structure closely. An economy built to produce at any cost begins to lose the reason for producing. The danger is not collapse. It is stagnation disguised as strength. This raises a thoughtful question. If history keeps repeating this pattern, what makes any modern system believe it can escape it? The long-term consequences of this pattern are already visible. They do not appear as a crisis. They appear as a slow change in direction. Today, China still produces more manufactured goods than any other country. Exports remain strong in absolute terms, but the returns from that output have weakened. According to recent industrial data, profit growth has lagged far behind production growth. In some sectors, profits have declined even as volumes increased. At the same time, household consumption has struggled to rise. Wages have grown more slowly. Job security feels less certain. This affects the global economy as well. Low-priced exports keep inflation down in many countries. They also make it harder for other nations to build their own industries. Manufacturers in Europe and North America face a difficult choice: compete at a loss, or exit entirely. Emerging economies feel it too. Their factories cannot match the prices. Their industrial plans stall before they mature. Inside China, policymakers speak often about rebalancing, shifting from exports to consumption, from volume to value. But change moves slowly. Local incentives remain tied to production. Debt still depends on factories running. According to policy analysts, this tension explains many recent decisions. Support is extended. Capacity remains. The past continues to shape the present. Infrastructure built for endless growth still demands use. This leaves a quiet but persistent question hanging in the air. If the system that created prosperity now limits it, what does adaptation really look like? That question brings the story to its final frame. The final frame is not about decline. It is about meaning. China's economic system did exactly what it was designed to do. It produced at unmatched scale. It delivered goods at unmatched speed. For years, that efficiency created real wealth. Living standards rose, opportunities expanded. But systems are shaped by what they reward. When they reward output above all else, output eventually overwhelms purpose. History offers a familiar echo. In the late Roman Empire, grain continued to arrive in abundance. The problem was not supply. It was distribution and incentive. China faces a similar moment. Factories still run. Ships still sail. What is weakened is the connection between effort and reward, between growth and prosperity. This does not mean collapse is inevitable. It means balance has become the scarce resource. The hardest adjustment is not technical. It is psychological. Slowing down can feel like failure in a system built on motion. Reducing output can feel like retreat, yet history suggests the opposite. Survival often requires restraint. The China trap is not about being too big. It is about being too cheap for too long. That leaves one final question to consider. When an economy has mastered efficiency, can it relearn moderation before efficiency consumes it?